name is Kathryn Grayson Nanz, and I'm the front-end developer and UI designer at Herman. For those of you who are maybe like myself, not the best note takers, you can find the slides and what is effectively a transcript of this talk, because I write them all from beginning to end, at these links. So I hope that's helpful to you. That being said, let's go ahead and jump into it. Over the last 2 years, I've been the lead on a project to create and implement a robust component library at Herman. When I first joined the company, there wasn't a lot in place in this regard. We had a print-oriented branding guide that kind of covered, your logos and your fonts and your colors. But it just wasn't meeting the needs of the kind of complex applications we were building. It didn't have the design guidance that we were looking for. And that was a real pain point. It meant that things like buttons or forms or headers, really any of our UI elements, were kind of left to the discretion of whoever was building that particular feature. Herman is a small but growing SaaS company, and our team of 6-7 engineers and developers are responsible for building and maintaining a suite of 3 web applications. As both the company and the applications continued to grow and evolve, it became really clear that not having this resource was creating friction in 3 main ways. The first and most notable was a real lack of consistency. Each application had a high-level style sheet, but there were always exceptions that had to be made. Thinner border here, thicker margin there. It quickly led to diverging styles, not just between our applications, but sometimes within a single application. UI elements didn't always match from page to page, depending on when it was built and who built it. And our CSS files were long and messy and redundant, and honestly involving a lot more importance than I would really like to admit on the record. The second issue is the UX struggles that this caused for our users. When you're not using these kinds of consistent UI patterns, your users never really get the chance to learn how your app is supposed to work. And that makes it really hard for them to actually use the app. If the confirm button is usually blue, but then on one page your cancel button is blue, your rate of user error and user frustration is going to be way, way higher on that page. Setting consistent expectations makes for a much smoother UX, and in general is going to increase your users' trust. If you do this right, they'll feel like things just work. And that kind of positive feeling carries beyond your application into their feelings towards your brand as a whole, your entire company. As will the opposite if their feeling is always, this sucks, or I hate this, or I feel so stupid when I use this. And finally, a somewhat less technical problem, everyone else kind of hated doing this. You know what a bunch of mostly back-end software engineers love to do? Write CSS. Oh yeah, that's right. They completely hate that. Go figure, but UI styling was not work that many of my team members enjoyed doing, or sometimes honestly felt really comfortable doing. And while I do happen to genuinely enjoy that kind of work, which I understand is bizarre, there was only one of me. And we really needed a way for all of our team members to feel enabled to work confidently with our UI. The creation of Myelin, which is the name that we've given to our component library at Herman, was the perfect solution to all of those problems, in addition to solving some that we didn't even really know it would help with, like improving the accessibility of our app or offering a place for us to do quick prototyping and user testing. It's been a hugely beneficial effort that's made our suite of web applications more user-friendly and more cohesive. I'm going to be using some of our components as examples during this talk, but I want to invite you to go ahead and visit it and kind of explore our library and see what we've built. Currently, we are just at the beginning stages of a project to expand Myelin from a component library into a full design system. So you'll kind of see that as you click around. We've got some information on design guidelines and some kind of higher level stuff. Our hope is that one day, in addition to the development tool that it is now, it can also be a reference for our whole company and a hub for our design assets and guidelines. But that's another talk in and of itself. If you just heard those issues and thought, wow, that sounds kind of similar to what's going on at my company, we could really use one of these, then good news, you're in luck. And if you haven't thought that, too bad, you're stuck here. We're about to take a high-level walk through all the steps of creating a component library, from tooling decisions and choosing which components you should be building, to getting buy-in from your team and maintaining that library once it's created. The first step to creating a component library is picking your tools and actually setting up the place where you're going to be writing these components, with one very big asterisk, which is especially big on this screen. You really shouldn't get too bogged down in this right now, in the nitty-gritty. Your goal at this point should be MVP. You want to just get enough in place to start writing some basic components and proving the value of your library. I'm not going to spend our limited time together today walking through setup minutia or how to build individual components, because frankly, that stuff is kind of the easy part of making a component library. Instead, what I want to do is kind of talk about what we're using at Herman, what tools we selected, and the steps that we went through to create the library and kind of how we maintain it, as well as some of the mistakes that we made, so that you don't have to do that kind of stuff, unless you enjoy it, in which case knock yourself out. Our applications are built primarily in React, and therefore so is our component library. I know you are all stunned to hear that at a React conference. To manage the library, we use Storybook, which is an incredible tool that I'm going to really highly recommend. If you visit our library, you'll see kind of the whole UI that's set up with the menu bar and the component previews and all the documentation stuff. That's all built into Storybook. They make it really, really easy for you to just focus on writing the components. Within Storybook, you can install additional things called add-ons and decorators that are going to add features to the Storybook UI. This is really cool, and there is about 1,000 of them out there. That do everything from helping you design for mobile responsiveness to creating routing-aware components. But I'm going to really urge you, if you're just starting out, to just keep it vanilla Storybook and not mess with that. It can be really easy to add so much in that you're actually making it more complicated for other people to come in and understand your library. I've found that it's better to leave those off for now and then only add them as you have actual reason to. To bring our animated components to life, we use GreenSock, which is a wonderful JavaScript animation library that just had another big release. If you're looking for a little bit of motion but want to keep things simpler, maybe just some transitions, animate.css is a great library for that. To supplement our own set of custom icons, we use Font Awesome. And we honestly waffled a little bit on whether to use Sass or not. There's a lot of benefits to be had there if you're looking to create some of those mix-ins and partials, if you have the time and experience to dedicate there. But we found that when we were looking realistically, most of what we wanted was CSS variables. And those are natively supported pretty much everywhere now. So we kept it vanilla here. Perhaps most importantly, though, you need a way to get the components from your library into your applications. We had a few main goals when we were deciding how to tackle this. First, we wanted to ensure that our library would be easy to install, easy to keep updated. We didn't want to add more work. Second, we wanted to be able to write in ES6 but output ES5. In the end, we chose Rollup, which bundles everything from our component library repo into its own library, which can then be added to our other applications via Git URL as a private package and managed like any other dependency. Because our library Myelin is only intended for internal use at Herman, we made a couple decisions, like choosing to keep that as a private package and allowing some dependency requirements that you may opt to do differently if you know that external use is going to be a big part of that at your company. All right, so you're all set up. You're ready to build some components. But how do you decide which ones to build? It can be incredibly tempting at this point to just take this as an opportunity to start over, throw out everything you've ever had, do a big UI redesign, or honestly, to do almost exactly the opposite and look at what another company has created in their component library and mimic all of those. But realistically, you're going to be better off leveraging what you already have. It's time to go through your existing application, screen by screen, and start cataloging the varieties of your existing UI elements. For example, what do the buttons look like on each page? Take a screenshot of each visually different button and start collecting them in a document. Brad Frost calls this taking interface inventory. He's written a really good blog post on it. And it can be a hugely beneficial thing to do when you're first starting out. Once you have that, you can look at all those little pieces of UI that show up most often, and ta-da, those are going to be your starter components. You want to try and cap this at like 8 to maybe 10 components max. And you want to keep that low, because one of the most common pitfalls of component library creation is the team that puts a huge amount of upfront time and energy into creating a beautiful, elaborate library that nobody ever uses. And this can happen for a variety of reasons, but most often it's because you just didn't make the right stuff. Nothing you made were components that were actually relevant. You want people to be able to immediately implement your library and start feeling the benefits. That's going to be a huge part of buy-in and getting people to actually use it. Once you can prove that, you get that quick win. You build momentum, excitement, and get that buy-in for your library. If your application has a fairly consistent design already, then creating a component will just be kind of moving that existing code into Storybook and tweaking it to accept props and whatever you need to do to make it a little more versatile. But more likely, you're going to discover that you have 3 or 5 or 20 different buttons. And now you have to choose which ones are going to be the buttons from now on. When you're making this decision, make sure that you're keeping in mind all the different contexts in which these are going to be used. You may find that you need a few different buttons to meet all those needs, and that's okay too. At Herman, we have a primary button, a secondary button, a small button, and 4 colored buttons in our brand colors. Start creating these components, but also make sure that you're nailing down the different situations where each one needs to be used. Another thing to keep in mind is how your components will need to change based on state. Does your button need a disabled state? It probably needs a hover state, and definitely needs a focus state. It's important to think about all the varied ways in which your users could be interacting with this component, and make sure you've thought through how it needs to respond in each situation. This kind of attention to detail is what ensures people will actually use your library. If your components aren't equipped to handle the kinds of real-world situations that your users will encounter, then again, people won't bother to use it. As part of the component creation process, make sure you're not just writing code, but also writing documentation, so other developers can understand how to use these different components correctly. A primary goal of creating a component library is consistency, and that's not just consistency of design, it's consistency of component use. Other people won't be able to guess your intentions for where you're supposed to use a primary button as opposed to a secondary button, so it's on you to define and share that information. Remember, the goal with the component library is always ease of use, ease of adoption. This checklist by Emma Wedekind is a really great resource for making sure that you kind of checked all the boxes and considered all aspects of your component during the creation process. She kind of calls out everything from customization and accessibility in the design phase to props and offering code snippets and examples and documentation. After that, you should have a pretty basic but small component library setup that's got a bunch of components that are ready for actual use. That means it's time to start actually using your library in your applications. This is the fun part. This means that you and your team and your users get to start reaping the benefits of all the work you've done thus far. You may have some small kinks to smooth out here in terms of integration. I remember a really dumb one that we had where one of our applications was running an older version of React than our library, and it didn't support JSX fragments. It took us a while to pinpoint that one. And we ended up having to go back and swap all the fragments for spans until we were ready to update. So annoying, but at least easy to fix. You may also notice at this point that some of those components you created in that bubble of the component library aren't quite meeting the needs of what they'll need to do in your actual application. You can prevent a lot of this by being really thorough when you're thinking through those states and use cases, but that's something that honestly will come with time and practice. The more you do it, the better you get. And in the end, there's almost always going to be 1 or 2 things you just won't realize a component needs until you're seeing it right in front of you in situ. Hopefully, though, these bumps in the road will be relatively minor and outweighed by the immense joy of KonMariing a bunch of your old code and letting these new components spark joy. This is also the point where you want to start bragging a little, honestly, getting some more folks on board with the library, showing them how useful it is, telling them how great it is, telling them how much easier it's going to make their life already, even with just this handful of components. While you're doing this, make sure that you're also asking for specific feedback, like what parts of the library do they find useful, or which parts are less useful? What makes them excited to use it? Are there blockers that are keeping them from using it right now? Did they hit any snags during implementation, either from a technical or a design perspective? You want to shop it around a little, you want to talk it up, you want to ask some questions, and keep iterating on it until you find the setup that's going to work for your specific team. Once you've got the basics and the libraries in use, it's time to start thinking about expanding. We keep a backlog of component ideas that we want to build someday, but don't really have an urgent need for right now. This could just be stuff we want to redesign or refactor, stuff that we know we're going to need for an upcoming feature, or stuff that people have requested specifically. I want to highly recommend actually writing these down and adding them to some kind of list or even your backlog, not just so you don't forget a good idea, but also because having it somewhere kind of public like that makes it easier for other people on your team to jump in and out, pick things up when they have time that they can invest in the library. And I found it's really important, the more people feel involved, the more they contribute, the more they'll kind of feel that urge to make use of it. When everyone gets involved, it gives them all a stake in the project. In terms of component library-related recommended reading, I cannot suggest Brad Frost's Atomic Design enough. It's free to read, so you have no excuses, and it's on his website. This is the approach we take to component building. We kind of combine our library of base atom components into larger and larger organisms. For example, our button component and our text entry component together create our search form. Our tile combined with our quadrant-specific icons and their colors create quadrant tiles, and then 4 of those together are a whole brain walk-around. Not only does this make your life so much easier, but it should also kind of be a reassurance that the components you're creating are correct. If you find yourself using them over and over and again, then they were definitely things that were worth building. On the flip side, you will probably also discover that some of the components you thought you needed, you don't really. It's good to go through and take stock every now and again and clean those unused components out of your library. Again, this is an ease of use thing. If it feels cluttered with components that aren't doing anything, it's going to be hard to navigate. When you go through and you're getting rid of something, make sure you're also checking in with other developers and designers to see what didn't work about it. It may just be something inconvenient about how it was built. Maybe it was too limited or too opinionated. Asking and getting that answer prevents you from throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You may be able to revise the component, or if it's a total loss, at least you learned something and you can not make that mistake again. As you're revising your library, make sure you're implementing some kind of tagging system with your components to denote their status. This doesn't need to be anything fancy. It could just be adding work in progress or retired to the end of a component name, or maybe separating them off into different sections. It just needs to be something so that nobody's surprised when something changes. You don't want to break anything because all of a sudden you got rid of a component and nobody noticed, and it was in an application, nobody saw it, now it's gone. Anything you do that creates extra work is going to be another hurdle, again, to implementation. I know I've said that a lot, I sound a bit like a broken record, but if you take anything away from this talk, it's that component libraries should be focused on ease of use. At Herman, we've also found a lot of value in having internal and external versions of our library. The link I've shown here with you guys is the external version, no offense. But that allows us to kind of have a safer space to kind of do some prototyping. It's where we keep those versioning labels. And it's just there might not be stuff that you want to share with everyone. It's a good way to kind of keep things separate and organized. In the same way that you can opportunistically refactor, at Herman we opportunistically maintain our library. Frankly, it's not always realistic to fit dedicated component library time into every single sprint. And even more frankly, you really don't need to once things get up and running. We look at our upcoming stories during sprint planning, and we see where component creation or refactoring can work into some existing stories, stuff that needs to be done anyway. Then we just kind of fold it all in and estimate it all as part of one story. It's helpful to keep that component library backlog pulled up during sprint planning if it's not already part of your general backlog. That way you can see if any of the components would be useful in upcoming work or add new ideas to the list for later. We've made contributions or edits to Myelin pretty much every single month since its creation well over a year ago, and I credit this approach primarily. If you don't continue to improve or expand your component library, it's going to eventually stop being relevant, and then people won't use it. Still, our component library journey has not been without a few missteps. And in addition to the ones that I've already kind of talked about, there were a few that I wanted to call out specifically that I really wish we had known when we started. This is the piece of advice I most wish someone had told me, which is keep it simple. Components are best when they're simple and flexible. When I was writing my first components, I intentionally kept them quite limited. I knew my fellow developers were not interested in making design decisions, so I tried to be as opinionated as possible on their behalf. For example, I was afraid that people would put too much content into a pop-up modal component. Modals are something that I feel should be used sparingly and with very minimal text and content. And while I was making the component, I just had these like worst case scenario visions of like these huge bloated modals that people had passed all this stuff into. And I was like, nope, you can have a header and you can have a line of text and that's it. An X to close the modal, that's all you get. But as it turns out, that's not actually what applications need. Before you know it, we had use cases where we needed a button or two buttons, a confirm deny, or a place to input an email address. And as I went back for like the third time and scraped all of my pre-written crap out of my component, I realized that I should have just let people pass in whatever children they wanted to from the get-go. In the end, I found myself frustrated by my own aggressive restrictions. You can't tell the future, and you will waste your time trying to guess all the ways in which people could use or misuse your components. It's going to be much better to start with a less opinionated component and then narrow down your use cases in the documentation. That's still important to define, but it shouldn't be limited in your build. You can always go back later and build in restrictions if they're really needed, but flexible components are the ideal. It makes your components more usable, and that's the goal. It's also okay and actually kind of beneficial to keep unfinished components in your library. At first, the component library was my baby, and I did not want anyone to see it in any form other than sheer perfection. This was a mistake. It prevented people from seeing what was in the works, from making suggestions, or thinking about how they could incorporate upcoming components. And even worse, it made people feel really uncomfortable creating or editing components on their own. The component library isn't an art museum. It's really more of an art studio. And a little untidiness is okay, as long as it's organized chaos. Plus, as an unintentional side effect to keeping those works in progress in Myelin, we've discovered that it's kind of the perfect place to prototype new things in isolation for quick and dirty user testing. Rather than constructing elaborate mock-ups in Figma or whatever, we can rough out something super fast in the library using the components we've already created, and then put that in front of users for them to actually be able to click and interact with and play with. That gives us incredible insight on what they focus on, what experiences are confusing, what's convoluted or unintuitive. It enables us to do fast, iterative, feedback-based development. And then when we're ready to build it for real in our application, the bulk of the front-end lift is already done. It just becomes a case of taking it out of the library into the application and kind of connecting the wires. If you build in accessibility at the component level, you get it for free in the application. I wish someone had told us that when we'd started, because often the task of making your app accessible feels really daunting and overwhelming if that wasn't a priority from day one. It's definitely something that we're struggling with a little. But the process of building for accessibility becomes a lot more accessible if you can break it down into these component-sized pieces and tackle it one bit at a time. Then every time you use that component, again, either in your application or to build more components, you get to leverage the work that you've already done. You're not starting from scratch every time. No need to reinvent the wheel. To wrap things up, after more than a full year of using our component library every single sprint, I feel incredibly confident that it was worth the upfront time and effort that we put in. I can say without hesitation that it's made my job easier as well as the job of my coworkers. And I've watched really proudly as it's become a reference for them, not just within our team, but actually within the company as a whole, as they look to it as a reference. If you are interested in building a component library, if you think that appeals to you, I would absolutely encourage you to look into it. And if you have any questions, I would love to talk to you about it anytime after this. Come and find me. I'd love to talk shop. And thank you guys all so much for having me, and happy component creating.